chairman of the United Jewish Communities told me not long ago that there was tremendous opportunity over these last 4 years, and he sees a tremendous likelihood that that opportunity will ultimately be wasted. That's the great tragedy. UJC and the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, the umbrella of the JCRCs across the United States, have recently put together funding, 7-digit funding, to create an umbrella for Israel advocacy efforts across the United States. They're staffed in Washington and in New York, and they're working directly with communities, with startups, trying to create an umbrella which will bring these organizations together, which will tap into the best ideas of the outsiders, which will try to give them a track to be involved in something bigger than their little startup organizations, and will try to mainstream them, if you will, to ensure that whatever happens to each individual organization, people who have discovered that they care tremendously, that they care deeply about Israel, that they care about what happens in Israel, that they care about how Israel is portrayed around the world, will have a way to express their caring and to do something, to take an active role, whether or not the little organization that they got started with ultimately succeeds or succumbs. The question can be asked, and when I talk to Israelis, it's usually the first question that gets asked. Well, how is what all these people are doing really helping us? What does it really mean at the end of the day? And truth be told, with some specific exceptions, a lot of this activism, a lot of this advocacy, it doesn't need millions of Jews involved in it. Again, to come back to the AIPAC example, 85,000 dues-paying members, 1.5% of the American Jewish population, and they have a significant impact on the relationship between Jerusalem and Washington. It doesn't take hundreds of thousands or even millions of Jews to ensure that relationship remains strong. Anybody who picks up on, for instance, AIPAC's personal narrative approach that they've been rolling out at college campuses across the United States over the last 2 years, in which they're training thousands of Jewish college students to engage other Jews and non-Jews, to engage in discussions about Israel. Not trying to make each one of these college students an expert on Israel or an expert on the Arab-Israeli conflict, because most of them aren't, despite all the talk about the primacy of Jewish education over the last decade. Your average college student in America today, your average Jewish college student who's committed, knows next to nothing about Israel. So they're trying to do some educating, they're trying to teach people some of the basics, but they also recognize that they're not going to turn hundreds of thousands of Jewish college students into experts on the conflict overnight. So they're trying to develop, and they have been rolling out, an approach that they call a personal narrative, where students talk to other students about what Israel means to them, about how they view Israel, what they think about Israel. They don't try to put themselves forward as experts. They don't try to put themselves forward as being able to answer every Palestinian or every Arab claim or contention. They put themselves forth as people who care about Israel, warts and all, and who try to spread messages explaining why Israel is important to them, why they think that Israel gets a bad rap on their campus, if they think that Israel gets a bad rap on their campus. These kinds of efforts have changed the lives of hundreds of thousands of American Jews. Now it's interesting, there's been very little statistical study done of the change in involvement with Israel, if you will, over the last 4 years. Stephen M. Cohen did a mailback survey about 2 years ago, in which he found that about 1 in 10 American Jews said that they've become more involved about Israel since the uprising began, and about 1 in 5 young American Jews said they've become more involved. Now, after processing it and analyzing his data, he came to the conclusion that these numbers were statistically insignificant. Some of us may say 1 in 10, 1 in 5, that sounds significant. Cohen came to the conclusion that it was statistically insignificant. You talk to people on the front lines of American Jewry, and they tend to agree with the 1 in 10 and the 1 in 5, and they take issue with the contention that it's statistically insignificant. Stephen Nassiter, the president of the Chicago Jewish Federation, one of the leading figures of American Jewish communal life, says with great respect for Stephen M. Cohen, he said, I can't accept those numbers. I can't accept that conclusion because it doesn't mesh with what I see in my own community in Chicago. It doesn't mesh with what I see when I visit other communities across the country. When you ask someone like a Nassiter, and what are you doing to ensure that this increased involvement stays? What are you doing to ensure that if things calm down, if things quiet down, that these people will continue to be involved, that they'll continue to donate money, to do things, to learn, to try to educate, to be connected, to be a part of the picture? And he talks about a lot of efforts, but he acknowledges that not enough is being done. When we look at the longer term relationship, when we look at the broader picture of relations between American Jews and Israelis, when we look at what most American Jews know about Israel and know about Israelis, those who have never been here, not surprisingly, have a lot of misconceptions, have a lot of notions that what they're doing must be changing every aspect of life in Israel. They must be appreciated beyond belief by every Israeli, morning, noon, and night. Once they come here, once they visit, once they see that Israel is not just the conflict, but that Israel is a three-dimensional place, and that there's a lot else going on here, they tend to start thinking about their role in somewhat different terms. An example I like to give is a senior at Berkeley by the name of Rebecca Simon. She came from a completely assimilated family in Southern California, had been to Israel once when she was 13. Her father took her. It wasn't a bat mitzvah trip. She didn't have a bat mitzvah. That was just the summer that they were both available. It was a nice trip. It could have been Italy. It could have been Spain. She had a good time, but it really didn't leave an impression with her. One of her first days at Berkeley, 4 years ago, she was walking on the quad, and she saw a table, and there was an Israeli flag, and there was a swastika. And there was another flag. It was red and green, and she thought it was Italian, but she wasn't sure. She thought it was interesting that someone was juxtaposing a swastika and a Magen David. So she went up to the person at the table. She stuck her hand out and she said, "Hi, I'm Rebecca Simon. Can you tell me about this stuff?" The guy spat on the ground and said to her, "I would rather die than shake the hand of a Zionist." Now, Rebecca Simon didn't know what a Zionist was. She didn't understand what this guy was all about. She noticed that he was staring at the Magen David she had on a chain around her neck. She didn't really know what the Magen David was. Her dad had given it to her before she came to college. He said it was a Jewish good luck charm. She left very confused. She went back to her room. She had no idea what to do. She asked a few other students. Nobody knew what any of this was about. Then she saw some flyers from Hillel. Come schmooze with the Jews, something like that. She went Friday night to Hillel House at Berkeley. Suddenly found hundreds of people who were interested in some of these issues that she had never thought about. When she retold the story of what had happened on the quad, a couple of people told her she should go to the Israel Action Committee. She went to the Israel Action Committee to a meeting. She got very involved. A year later, she was instrumental in bringing Ehud Barak to speak on campus to an audience of 2,000. She became a leading advocate for Israel on one of the hottest campuses in the United States. She got very involved in Hillel. She got very involved in AIPAC. She got very involved in a number of tracks to learn about the conflict and to advocate on behalf of Israel in Berkeley. Aside from that trip when she was 13 years old, she hadn't been to Israel. And as I talked to her last spring, and she was very excited that she was going on a birthright trip in June, but as I talked to her last spring, I couldn't help but wonder what kind of impact that visit to Israel would have on her. So when she came back in the beginning of July, I called her. How was it? Oh, it was wonderful. It was great. We saw so much. We did so much. We met people. We this, we that, we the other. She said, but you know, all the sites were amazing. All the history was amazing. All the analysis that we heard, and all of the lectures that we heard, and all the behind the scenes that we saw, and all the young people that we met, it was all great. But more than anything else, what amazed me was that Israelis weren't talking about the matzav all day long. When we met some Israeli college students, and I started talking about the security fence, and they said to me, let's talk about other things. Let's talk about what you do for fun. Let's show you some of the clubs where we go. Let's go. She was completely taken aback. And it caused her to understand that all of her advocacy and all of her concern, as important as it was missing insofar as an effort to make her understand Israel, to make her understand Israelis. She came back to Berkeley, immediately registered in a class to learn Hebrew. She said she was particularly upset when there were, 1,000, 1,500 birthright participants at Binyanei Ha'omah at a major happening. Prime Minister Sharon came, and first he spoke in Hebrew, and of course she didn't understand a word. And then he spoke in English, and when she asked for a translation of the Hebrew, she was shocked and upset to find out that what he had talked about in Hebrew and what he had talked about in English were completely different. And she decided that the only way to get over that was to learn Hebrew, was to find a way to come back here and spend 6 months or a year, and to try to learn about the country, not just the cause. There's not enough going on in America today to ensure that young people and older people who care, who are motivated, who have seen this spark take off, there's not enough going on to make sure that they understand the reality of Israel and not just the reality of the conflict. So, for all of the advocacy efforts that are underway, for all of the letter writing, for all of the media monitoring, for all of the rallies, for all of the shopping fairs, everything else that's going on, and a lot of these efforts are terrific, and a lot of these efforts do help specific aspects, whether helping the economy insofar as helping a few artists who come to shopping fairs, whether raising public awareness by having high school information campaigns, whether raising hundreds of millions of dollars through an Israel emergency campaign, money that gets sent to Israel and used for social services. Nobody would argue that these efforts don't matter. But the bigger picture in which American Jews don't really understand this country, in which American Jews don't really understand the day-to-day dynamic of this country, if we're hoping that there'll be a stronger bridge of connection between American Jews and Israel, then that has to be improved. Birthright is a great step in the right direction. On one level you can say, what can you really learn or see in 10 days? And for many students, for many participants, that's absolutely true. They come for 10 days, they say it changed their life, and then they go back to their college in America or wherever else they are. They came from around the world. Don't do anything else, don't get involved. It doesn't change their lives. But some of the early research, we're starting to see some longer-term research coming out of Brandeis, looking at the longer-term impact of birthright trips. We're finding that Rebecca Simon and her newfound connection and her new understanding that she's missing a lot of the picture isn't unique. It's not widespread enough, but it isn't unique. It's building these real three-dimensional connections. It's building this real desire to understand not only the conflict, but also Israel and all of its other dimensions that can lead to tremendous improvement in the connection between diaspora Jews and Israel. We're not even talking this morning about the other direction, about what Israeli Jews know and think they know and assume about American Jews, about diaspora Jews. I find from many conversations that among Israeli Jews who don't work in tourism or don't work for the government or the Jewish agency or in other very specific slices of Israeli life, if the Midrachov has no American Jewish students, wandering up and down and sitting in the cafes and making too much noise, the assumption is that American Jews have written us off. I find that last year, and Manfred made mention of the GA that was held in Jerusalem and the thousands of North American Jews who marched through Jerusalem. A few weeks later, when I asked a number of Israelis what they knew about the GA, what they knew about this visit of 4,000 American Jews, for the most part I got blank looks. A couple of people said, oh, I saw something on television, but I didn't pay attention. There's not enough going on to try to educate Israelis about this whole world of diaspora Jewry, about this whole world of connection to Israel, of a link to Israel, of a sense of peoplehood that makes so many American Jews feel that they have a stake in what happens here. There's a lot of misperceptions on both sides. As we see initiatives like the Israel Advocacy Initiative of UJC and the Jewish Council for Public Affairs start to gather steam, start to get some serious funding behind them, it gives room for a lot of optimism. It gives room for some hope. There's a lot to be done. As Richard Wechsler says, it may end up being a missed opportunity because it took 4 years to get this joint effort going. And in those 4 years, there was the peak, there was the height of the so-called Intifada, there was the height of concern among American Jews about Israel. And face it, when you don't see photos of bombed-out buses every day or every week, for many people who were peripherally involved and peripherally concerned, they're not going to think about it anymore. They're going to go back to their former lives, if you will. The need to reach out to American Jews who care, to try to find ways to plug them into efforts, and to try to find ways to plug them in to ways that they can really learn about Israel as a country, not just as a conflict, needs to happen. These new efforts that are underway are the beginning, they're a good start. And if they're to succeed, they're going to have to reach out to all the grassroots organizations, to the startups, to the outsiders who care but have not found a way to be plugged in to the broader organizational picture. They're going to have to find a way to plug these people in and to make them understand that it's not just their little startup movement in Boston or in Eugene, but it's a much bigger picture that spans the world. And only when these efforts are made, and only when these efforts start to succeed, will we see a brighter long-term outlook. Thank you very much.
The leadership of the you spoke about that there's some kind of new leadership in terms of the age group that belongs. Is there any survey about that, about the age of the leadership 50 years ago, 30 years ago, and what's going on right now on the American Jewry? And another completely different question. Through your words, it seems that we need some anti-Semitism, some anti-Israelism to bring back Jews to Jewish involvement. I would like you to relate to that.
On your first question, I don't have statistics. I do know that when you go to a board meeting of a Jewish federation or when you go to a national board meeting of a national Jewish organization, you've got a lot of gray hair, you've got a lot of white hair. I know that when you go to almost any Jewish community across the country and you go to any event that isn't directed at the parents of nursery school kids, you've got a lot of gray hairs there as well. The big challenge is to draw in the 20-somethings, 30-somethings, 40-somethings. You know, a couple of years ago it came to me as a shock to learn that United Jewish Communities calls young leadership anything up to 45. That's maybe that should help some people. That should encourage some of you who are approaching middle age. But it's a challenge. It's a challenge, and for all the excuses and all the explanations that can be put forth, oh well, younger people are busy raising their families and busy building their careers. They have to be drawn in. They have to be drawn in, and a lot of them have been attracted to some of these startups, and that's why the human capital that's involved in some of these startup organizations should be so attractive to some of the national organizations. And that's why it's very frustrating to see that the national organizations have been very slow to reach out in any constructive way. As to your question about the need for anti-Semitism or anti-Israelism to spark people, to motivate people to get involved, I wish it was different. But look, in the 1990s, when the perception was that things were going to be fine, American Jews went about their business. They focused on other issues. If things were to quiet down now and remain quiet for a sustained period of time, that's where we get to what Richard Wexler terms the possibility of a tremendous lost opportunity. Because we've had this spark, we've had this upsurge in involvement and in activism and in willingness to invest time and energy in things related to this relationship. As time passes, if things quiet down, the people who were willing may not be willing anymore.
Ambassador David Efrati,
Yes.
then Rabbi Moshe. David.
I was very impressed by your remarks, but I wanted to know one thing. You concentrated on the bidimensional spectrum of Israel and the United States Jewry. As far as I understand, there are also many startups in the United States today who want to add another dimension. That means to add the diaspora Jewry, especially in Eastern Europe and so on, especially the youth in this country, in this spectrum of activities. Could you maybe enlarge a little bit more about that?
Obviously, the Israel-U.S. Jewry relationship does not encompass everything else that's involved in world Jewry. There has been, over the last 15 years, an increase in interest in very small circles in the United States among American Jews in the developments in Eastern Europe, among Jewish communities, whether everything from Poland to Hungary to the countries of the former Soviet Union. It hasn't been a mainstream focus. You know, for instance, Ronald Lauder has invested millions of dollars in Poland and Hungary and other countries in building Jewish schools and helping to provide the infrastructure for Jewish communal life to resume since it's been allowed to exist. Most American Jews are not involved in that. Most American Jews really think in terms of two main focal points for the Jewish world, and those two main focal points being Israel and the United States, or in the eyes of most American Jews, they would put them in the other order, the United States and Israel.
Moshe, and afterwards Chaim Zohar.
Very interesting, I must say, because I know more about the European Jewry. And in Europe today, it doesn't look nice. And not relations Jews and Jews, and not relations between Jews and non-Jews. And here I hear that startups, and organizations, and hundreds of thousands, whether it's people or money, are those startups interested in keeping the Jews Jews, or are they interested in getting those Jews nearer to Israel? Just saying. Because I understand that Mrs. in Los Angeles, when she got the idea of strengthening something, she wanted to strengthen maybe Los Angeles, the Jews in Los Angeles, because it's not nice to open the television today and see those things, and I have to look for myself, and not so much for Israel. That's number one. Number two, you say that until now it's quite successful. Those new startups and those organizations, etc., etc. In Europe, we also try. And the secret word that we have heard now for the last 50 years is haspara. Not much has. What kind of haspara do those people, those Jews, what do they use? What do they say to a congressman? What do they use for terms? How do they succeed in getting that person to think positively about Israel after that he has looked on CNN? If you can teach us in Europe what to do, we will take it immediately.
Excellent questions, excellent points. You mentioned the example of Raz Rothstein in Los Angeles. I would mention instead the example of John Kerry in San Francisco. John Kerry was bothered by this outbreak of, or an upswing in the instances of anti-Israel rhetoric and bumper stickers and rallies and whatever else in Berkeley, surprise, surprise. And a big part of what's motivated him, he's trying to help Israel. He'll say it very openly, I want to help Israel, I want to help Israel improve its image, but I also want to help me and other Jews in the San Francisco Bay Area feel secure and feel safe and be able to live as Jews here. There's very little, despite the fact that the Aliyah numbers are inching up from North America over the last couple of years, there's very little focus in American Jewish communities on encouraging Aliyah. There's very little focus on this message of the only place for Jews to be in Israel. It's not there. It's not part of the lexicon. It is much more accepted in many American Jewish circles today that someone will move to Israel. It's not seen as the disaster or the problem or the undesirable that it might have been a couple of decades ago in many circles, but it's not something that organized American Jewry or grassroots startups on a widespread basis are doing to really, it's not a focus of their efforts. What kind of messages are grassroots advocates and more institutionalized advocates using? When you spend a day or two or three with the folks from AIPAC, what's more impressive than anything else is that everybody, from the youngest to the oldest, from the most peripherally involved to the most active and key players, they all use very similar language. They all touch on many of the same themes. I can meet with AIPAC student advocates and activists on a campus in Texas and on a campus in Illinois and hear the same phrases coming out. They're being trained with some phrases that work. They're being trained with some notions that work, that talk about the shared values of the United States and Israel, that talk about some shared enemies that the United States and Israel face, that talk about two democracies, that talk about the alliance between the countries. Obviously, in the case of many European countries, not all those messages would apply. In some cases, they would apply. The